Welcome to FO Talks. I'm Peter Isackson, the Chief Strategy Officer at Fair Observer. I'm here with our Editor-in-Chief, who will be answering questions today about what's going on between Israel and Iran.
Thank you, Peter, for welcoming me. What's going on with Israel and Iran? Well, it's a good old bish bash bosh. So, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or Bibi Netanyahu, or Benjamin Netanyahu, howsoever you want to pronounce his name, has decided if it is not us, who, if it's not now, when. So he's decided that for Israeli security and his own personal legacy, as well as his hold and grip on power, it is the opportune time to strike Iran. And he has done so. He's hit their nuclear strikes. He has eliminated a large number of top generals. He's basically taken out the creme de la creme of of Iranian military. And Iran is stung. And this has happened at a time when Iran was in negotiations with the US. And Donald Trump was talking about a new era of commerce, not chaos. So we are back to chaos in the Middle East. Iran, of course, has struck Israel in retaliation because Iran now thinks, hang on a minute, my back is to the wall. Hamas is greatly weakened, although it is still causing trouble for Israel in Gaza. Hezbollah has been hit hard. Their top leadership is gone. The great operation of Pages, both terrifying and brilliant, caused a number of people to lose their limbs or suffer injuries. And indeed, the founder of Hezbollah and many of the top people are dead. And Syria has imploded. Syria now has many cantons like Switzerland, but they are not exactly peaceful. We predicted it. You can watch the video we did with our editors on Syria, and we said, look, this is pretty much going to devolve into an ethnic civil war for a bit, and then enclaves of different ethnicities living hopefully in the long term harmoniously together, but in the short term, there'll be a lot of violence in the interim. And Israel has decided that it will do three things. Number one, in the short run, destroy Israel's nuclear capability. Number two, in the medium run, regime change. This is, quote unquote, as one Israeli said to me, the start of the road to regime change. And number three, do unto Iran what Israel has done unto Syria, which means that ideally the Balochs go their own way, the Azerbaijanis take over the Azeri part of Iran, the Kurds have their own enclave, if not their independent state, and you have a weakened Iran unable to mount an existential challenge on Israel. So that, in a very, very, very brief nutshell, is what is going on, Peter.
Yes, I know. I have the same impression that that is what the intentions are, as you expressed it. But wouldn't you say that it could be slightly unrealistic at this point, and that there's a question hanging over the whole business, and that is, if it continues, what will the role of the US and the European allies of Israel be, and how is that likely to play out? And is it the prelude to World War III?
I think, Peter, we are not quite there at the level of the death of the firstborn and bubonic plague. So I think to worry about World War III might be a bit premature. But there is a risk of broadening of conflict, even as we speak, and we are speaking on Saturday. We are speaking at 10:45, roughly, a.m. Eastern time. There's about to be a parade in the honor, a military parade in the honor of Donald Trump. And Iran has warned it will target UK, US, and French bases in the Middle East if these countries help defend Israel. So we are certainly moving up the escalation or escalatory ladder. That is clear. And know that we know that the Americans are indeed already helping Israel, especially when it comes to air defense. They haven't yet struck Iran. They don't want to. They don't want to get dragged into a deeper war and a bigger war, especially after they ordered one of their two aircraft carriers out of the region. So we know that the Americans don't want to be a party to it more than defending Israel. And I'm sure the UK and the US don't want it either. You sit in France, Peter, and we have friends in the UK, both of us. And our friends in the UK are not exactly jumping up and down in woolen underwears, celebrating this fantastic feat. So, what we have right now is certainly an Iran that feels conquered, an Iran that feels, okay, no matter what we negotiate, or rather, I should make the distinction between Iran and the Islamic regime, an Islamic regime that is convinced that everyone is out to topple the regime and therefore has to retaliate to show there are costs to intervention. But at the same time, it has to walk a tightrope. If Iran goes all out, if the regime goes all out, then the result may actually be crushing military defeat and fall of the regime. It's already an unpopular regime. So, are we on the first step to World War III? Probably not. Are we on for a longer conflict? Most certainly, because both Iran and Israel are now locked into a struggle which each deems existential.
That's the
If I
question.
can
Sorry.
challenge you on those questions, that is my impressions from what I've heard from the various testimonies I've heard in the past 24 hours. The Iranians seem to be very unified in perceiving this as uh, an attack on their existence, as an existential challenge. Um, so, if you're talking about the hope that there will be regime change, which seems to be the motivation, not only in on the part of Israel, but in the U.S. And I would question how unified the U.S. is, because you say they don't want a war with Iran, but there are people who do, such as Lindsey
Certainly.
Graham. So we know that there's quite an important and significant division within the Trump administration, which is not the most unified administration we've ever seen. So you have all these factors of ambiguity, which I think implicate danger. That it implies that we're in a risky situation where nobody's in control, and that's why I think there is a serious risk that this could not only become a regional war, but a global war.
Okay. Well, so Peter, you're absolutely right. There are hawks in this regime who would like to topple the Iranian regime. I mean, in this regime, I mean, in the Trump administration. But at the end of the day, when you stay in Washington, D.C., and I do, or rather, I am right now here, I travel far too much, but at the moment, I'm here. And very interestingly, Iran is not top of people's minds.
Hmm.
The parade is. This is an insular country and increasingly getting more insular. The Make America Great Again crowd that is in Washington today, and I met some of them last night. They didn't really care too much about the Middle East. They didn't really care about this Israel and Iran clash to the extent that Iranians are the bad guys and we have to support our friends. the Israelis, the good guys against the bad guys. So if you remember, yes, Prime Minister and Sir Humphrey Appleby says the public are just interested in knowing who are the goodies and who are the baddies. And for the Make America Great Again crowd, the goodies are the Israelis, the baddies are the Iranians, and they have to defend the goodies who happen to be their friends as well. But they don't want to really go out and have a punch up for them. They might lend them their pistol, their Colt .45, but they don't really are gagging for a fight. So to extrapolate your fears that there are hawks who are in charge in this administration is unwise, because you do not have an ideologically determined administration, as in the case of George Bush Jr., wherein the neoconservatives did want to convert the Middle East into a new democratic playground where they, of course, had the oil. They did think of the axis of evil, or the president did say so. And that included, wasn't it Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, if I
That's right.
remember correctly?
That's right.
So this is a very different administration. This is an administration that has very little ideology. It's an open secret that whoever has Donald Trump's ear last influences him most. So there's a lot of erraticism in policy making. I've met a number of diplomats, including ambassadors, who say you have no idea what's coming next. So it is very clear that there isn't a plan for war, for regime change on the part of the US. But the US might just get dragged in, because no American politician can really be seen as anti Israel. After all, you have to support the goodies against the baddies. And if Iran were to strike American targets, if Iran was to actually hit targets even in the Gulf, then we are talking about a very different conflict. So, all in all, it's uncertain. But yes, we are certainly in full-scale conflict now.
Well, I would
Even
add
if the
one.
US does get dragged in,
Yeah.
that doesn't make it World War III yet. It's only World War III if the US gets dragged in on Israel's side and Russia gets dragged in on Iran's side. And I don't see the narrative of that plausibly happening.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Anton, just 1 second, to your point, Russia's primary interest is to finish the job in Ukraine. Russians are not going to get distracted by the Iranians. They will lend some help. They may send some S-400s. They may send some air defense stuff. They may help them out a little bit here and there, because they've taken Iranian help in the past. But Russia certainly cannot divert men, money, and material to Iran right now. They have to finish the job in Ukraine. And for all you know, one is hearing about a backroom deal between Bibi Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin, both of whom actually are not too dissimilar. Both are former officers, and they appear to be not, shall we say, exactly foes. They seem to get along all right. They may not be too fond of each other, but they certainly don't have the personal animus that, say, the Ukrainians and Russians have. And if there is a backroom deal in which Russia gets to digest Ukraine and Israel gets a relatively free hand in Iran, that'll be all right. China is getting cheap oil from Iran. Should the regime crumble, that would not be in Chinese interest. But the Chinese Navy cannot project power so far out in the West. They are still not ready. Yes, they are building lots of ships, but they don't have naval experience. That takes time. That sort of naval muscle takes time to build. The Chinese don't have an expeditionary army either. They have some good technology. They have a lot of drones, and I think they might share some of that with Iran, but that would be again hush hush off the record on the QT. So we are not quite at World War III. And also remember that Europe will not intervene on behalf of Israel given what is going on in Gaza. Because in European capitals, the narrative that Israel is conducting a genocide holds sway. That is what most people I speak to in politics and in diplomacy believe. And so, given that belief, it is unlikely that European capitals are going to be coming out, on white horses, galloping like Richard the Lionheart for the original shining city on the hill, or not quite the shining city on the hill, but the holy city to three faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Jerusalem. So I don't think Europe is going to get involved, and the rest of the world, Latin America, yeah, it's too far away. The left will support the Iranians, the right, who are descendants of conquistadores. Some of them will applaud the Israelis. The Indians are a bit nervous because they also have imported cheap oil from Iran, and Iran is a convenient semi-ally against Pakistan, so they don't want Iran to be too weakened, but at the same time they get a lot of their defense stuff, including air defense stuff, from Israel. And Israel is the third largest exporter of arms after Russia and France to India. So the Indians are going to sit it out. The Aussies, I doubt them coming in. So, unlike World War II, where you had Australian troops and Kiwi troops and Canadian troops and Russians and Japanese, well, of course, the Japanese are going to sit it out, and Americans and the Brits and the Germans and the French and so on and so forth. And the theater of war was all the way from North Africa to North Asia. I don't see that transpiring anytime soon.
Well, let me just mention why I have these suspicions or fears, if you like. I lived through the entirety of the Cold War,
Mm-hmm.
so I saw lots of things going on, which were more reassuring at that time than anything I can see today. This is my personal impression. Now, uh, I know for a fact historically that there were moments when, and we of course lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was a very real risk, immediate and pressing risk at given moments that we would be in a shooting war with the Soviet Union. That year, that's well, about a year later, I had the privilege of seeing Doctor Strangelove um, shortly before its release in a Hollywood studio, and that's part of our historical memory of my generation. The situation, when you look at the Trump administration, is such that it
Excuse
just
me.
reminds me of
I'll
Dr.
stop you,
Strange.
Peter. Someone, there's background noise coming in from someone. That'll hurt the recording. So be careful, please. Mute yourself if you're not speaking.
So, yes, I'm just saying that Dr. Strangelove is a parable of what the actual world, Cold War was like. And obviously, in one version, it ends with a pie fight. There was another version that was supposedly different. Um,
Peter,
we're
what's
in the
the point?
unknown. We're in the
What's the
unknown,
point?
and there are random people who actually have the power to do things which do not correspond to rational the rational thinking that you laid out for the different actors.
Peter, yeah, fine. I take your point. But the reality is that this crisis is probably going to continue days and weeks. As of now, there is no concentration of forces that threatens to spill over. Yes, a terrorist attack could change stuff, There are rumors that Iran will use Hezbollah to strike Jewish targets in Latin America. Uh, Lots could happen. Iran could strike water facilities and energy facilities in Israel. That could change things. So lots could happen, lots will happen, but I don't see Europeans suddenly marching to war in the Middle East, or the Russians, or the Chinese, or the Indians, or indeed the Africans who are closer. So yes,
I
it
don't
could
think it
be
would
a
be
full
a
out. It could be a full out regional war. The Gulf could get dragged in. That is certainly possible. The price of oil could shoot up. That is a big risk to the global economy. And the US certainly could be dragged in, and possibly would be dragged in should things take a turn for the worse. But the rest of the world will say, meh, yeah, the Middle East, who cares? This goes on forever in the Middle East.
I
Anyway,
would.
we must take questions from everyone here. So one after the other. Peter and I shouldn't monopolize the
I just
discussion.
want to make one point. I believe that there is no way, with the parallel dramas that are going on now with Ukraine and the Middle East now. It's not just Gaza, it's a double problem. You've got Gaza, you've got all the other situations you described, plus Iran. With what's going on today, I don't see any possibility of all these people coming together and saying, well, let's go back to the situation antebellum. That
That's
we're,
not going to happen. Peter, I've long said many years ago, over a decade ago, and you know I have said it and people can read it. I said this is the beginning of the 30 Years' War in the Middle East, because the boundaries that Mr. Sykes and Miss Yupiko drew are utterly irrelevant. Syria has imploded. It doesn't exist. It exists on paper. And it will never exist again as one entity, because those were lines that were completely arbitrary. Lebanon is dysfunctional. Iraq, the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis have gone their separate ways. Iran itself, which has been an empire and has imperial memory, will find itself under strain, and has found itself under strain. The ethnic minorities do not enjoy the domination of the Farsi speakers. Women do not like the restrictions. Urban Iranians chafe at high unemployment, and any educated Iranian is trying really hard to get out of Iran.
but
So,
they blame sanctions for that. They blame sanctions.
sure, Peter,
The,
that may be so, but they don't like the regime either. All right,
yeah,
Iran, the young in Iran have lost religious belief. There is real fear amongst the more conservative Iranians, not just members of the regime, that Iran could revert to Zoroastrianism, or even worse, atheism and hedonism. So Iran is going through its massive social changes because it has an educated population. It has a modern population. That is not a challenge many other Middle Eastern states are facing, that loss of belief. So
but that's
Iran
happening
is,
everywhere. Europe is imploding, and it's partly due to the situations both
yeah,
in Europe and in
and
the
and
Middle East.
and Israel itself is on the verge of civil war. This is a fact very
Right.
few people make. So let's talk about Israel. Israel, it has managed to do all these wonderfully spectacular military things, which some may deem as inhuman, some may deem as unjust, but from a military point of view, their intelligence and special operations activities are just sensational. They've demonstrated that they can kill anyone, anytime, anywhere in Iran, or for that matter, Lebanon, or for that matter, Syria. So they are clearly a very powerful military state. Now, who built Israeli military? It was the secular Jews largely. It was the Ashkenazis from Europe who came, and they created this extraordinary military machine, this extraordinary warrior culture. Now, most of these secular Jews don't have many children. Who has more children? The Orthodox, the Haredis. And they don't serve, and they don't pay taxes. Now there's a law which says they should serve in the military, but no politician has made them serve in the military because everyone wants their votes. There's also tension with the Mizrahis. We know what happened in Israel before Gaza blew up. There was demonstrations on the streets. Reservists were campaigning against Bibi Netanyahu's judicial reforms. And in fact, part of the reason some say the attacks happened was because reservists were protesting and the military had thinned out. So Israel itself is a house divided, and the only thing keeping it united right now is war. And it has a prime minister who could be tried for corruption should he lose power. So he needs war in a way. He needs war because he
But
believes.
that's where that's Dr. Strangelove, you
Yeah,
see.
he probably, because he believes he is a man of history and he is the historical figure who will guarantee Israeli security, but also subconsciously, if not consciously, he knows that should war end and should he lose power, he might be in hot water. So and of course his coalition is dominated now by two utter right-wing nutters, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are talking about ethnic cleansing and genocide. So Israel itself is highly unstable. So yes, we will have an extremely unstable region. And yes, maybe you're right. This is the era of instability. This is the age of Mars, not Venus. Make war, not love, is the slogan of the era. And perhaps China will make a move on Taiwan, and indeed we'll have World War III. But unless something pulls China into a conflict with the US, I think we are still not quite at World War III levels. And that is where I'll stop. We'll get back to Iran. Questions from others, because this is meant to be an examination of all the questions you have after reading the headlines in the media, but the answers you don't. And I'll try my best to give you a somewhat intelligible answer.
Yeah, I have a question. Um, Early in the year, Israel and Syria were exchanging missiles back in April or May. And I'm wondering, and that was really done for Israel to garner sympathy from the international stage, if I'm remembering correctly. So is Israel done with garnering sympathy from international actors, or are they still trying to do that within this new tit for tat?
Israel has, I'll come to you, Nick, in a second. Israel has decided that it doesn't really need sympathy anymore. It
Mhm.
has written off Europe. In fact, Israel thinks, and they genuinely, Israelis believe, that they are doing the dirty work for the Gulfies. Saudi
Mhm.
Arabia wants to control Iran. The United Arab Emirates are scared of Iran. Yes, the Qataris are ambivalent, and Omanis, but uh, the Gulfies don't want a strong Iran. The Gulfies would ideally act against Iran if they were able to, if they weren't so soft. And so Israel thinks they are controlling a regime that has exported terror, and it is a regime that took power as a millenarian regime, as a regime led by mullahs, and a regime that has fostered instability through proxy actors. And say, so they genuinely see themselves as the state that launders the West's dirty linen. And
Mm.
so they are done with looking for sympathy from Europe, and they are
Yeah.
not looking for sympathy even from the US, but they want US support. And
Mhm.
the focus is to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities before these capabilities act as a major threat to Israel. Look, Iran, the Iranian regimes, the Islamic regime's endgame is to have a nuclear weapon because that is the
Yeah.
ultimate deterrent. Okay, if you
Mm.
have a nuclear weapon, you can be like Pakistan and you'll be bailed out n number of times by the International Monetary Fund. You have nuclear insurance. You can be North Korea and people don't push you too far. So
Right.
as far as Iran is concerned, the regime is concerned, they want that bomb. As far as Israel is concerned, Iran has sworn to eliminate Israel. Iran has a deeply religious element to it. Look, there's no reason for Iran to look west except Islam. Until the Shah was in charge in 1979, Israel and Iran had pretty good relations. Iran was not involved in 1948, the war that almost led to the demise of Israel even before it was born. All the Arab states invaded Israel. And that is a foundational uh, stone of the Israeli psyche. They've not forgotten
Mm-hmm.
that. 1967, again, Six-Day War, Iran wasn't involved. 1973, again, Yom Kippur War. It was the Arabs. It was Egypt and Syria.
Yeah.
This helped, but the threat to Israel again and again was Arab nationalism, which it tried very hard to control. And once, after Camp David Accords, Egypt switched sides, over from the Soviet Union to the USA. Israel suddenly could breathe easy on its western front. Okay, and it
Mm-hmm.
returned Sinai. But Iran becomes a problem only after 1979. And the only reason is really Islam, because Iranian national interest is probably looking east. Iran is not a Middle Eastern, it is a Middle Eastern power, but it's not entirely a product of Middle Eastern culture. Apart from Islam, there's very little in common between the Persians and the Arabs. Different
Right.
culture. And
Yeah.
the Persians look down on the Arabs. They see them as barbaric. Iranians still see themselves as more sophisticated, and Iran's influence was much greater to the east. Remember, till 1858, the official language of India was Farsi. Afghans speak Farsi. The Taj Mahal was built for a Farsi woman, for an Iranian woman, and it, of course, led to famine in India. So Iran may exert influence in the stans where they have cultural influence. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, the former is, stans. So the reality is that uh, Iran's end game is to get a nuclear bomb, the regimes. Israel's end game is to topple the regime, and so the die is cast. And Israel has stopped looking for sympathy. And in fact, and this is an important thing, I met quite a few people from Make America Great Again crowd, the MAGA crowd, and a lot of them believe that Israel does not show enough gratitude. They don't really care
Hmm.
too much about Israel, but they say,
Interesting.
they should say thank you a little bit more. Because, of course, that is what J.D. Vance told Zelensky, Ukrainian
Mm-hmm.
president. Because the
Yeah.
MAGA crowd genuinely believes that, I mean, forget the evangelicals who support Israel for religious reasons, but the
Mm-hmm.
MAGA crowd believes money should be spent in the US, jobs should come to the US, the loyalty of American congressmen and senators should be to the US. And one of them said that a certain congressman went more often to APAC events than to his local Lutheran church, and that was unacceptable. So there's trouble brewing for Israel in the long run because they have become powerful. They don't no longer care about winning sympathy. They are exerting force and brute force, and no longer focused as much on the narrative as the early founding fathers of
Right.
Israel were. The early
Mm-hmm.
founding fathers of Israel cultivated the labor movement in the US. Remember Martin Luther King. Look at Joseph Olmert's videos on Fair Observer. And he talks about how the left in the US was quite pro Israel. And a lot of the civil rights movement, a lot of the labor movement in this country involved, surprise, surprise, Jewish organizers. Even the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa had a lot of Jewish leaders. So from that era to this era, the wheel has turned enormously.
Gotcha.
Yes, Nick, you had a question.
Nick, I think he's frozen.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I'll step in with another question.
He's unfrozen.
There we go.
Yeah. Nick, the
Nick,
next question is yours. Anton, you've started, so finish.
Sure. So let's bracket off the possibility of international escalation. A most likely scenario is Iran and Israel either give up and go back to the status quo ante, which seems less likely now, or that they...
It's impossible. How can they go back to status quo ante? How can any power go back to status quo ante? If you are an Iranian leader, you know you have a target on your back, maybe in the middle of your eyes. And you cannot trust negotiations. You are negotiating, and yet you're being killed.
Israel has taken a step from targeting the Iranian nuclear program itself to targeting the Iranian state. And they've
Or the
made...
leaders of the Iranian states, especially the military leaders. I mean,
Sure,
what's stopping them from
they
killing
eliminated the
Khamenei?
president.
They could kill Khamenei, clearly. Ayatollah Khamenei could be next.
Nobody's going to march across Mesopotamia anytime soon, so this will be an air war. And my question is, can you really topple a state by shooting at it without an invasion?
Excellent question. And it's funny, I have a British friend, an English friend actually, who we spoke a long time, and we discussed this. And he said, look, Germany and Japan, to convert them from Nazi Germany, or for that matter, a militaristic Japan, to a modern democratic state, needed lots of GIs, a new constitution, the Marshall Plan, and whatnot. Okay. How do you do so in Iran? Who's going to... Is Michelle Goldberg going to move there? Is the new viceroy of Iran going to be Bibi Netanyahu's cousin, who will arrive there as a swashbuckling lawmaker and reformer, imposing a new constitution? And his point was exactly yours, that you cannot have regime change just by targeted assassination and by protracted military strikes. Now, the counter to that, which the Israelis and the Iranian dissidents make, and sometimes I think in Washington, Iranian dissidents get far too much of airtime, just as Iraqi dissidents did, and they color reality. And they preach this gospel that the regime has failed to deliver for its people, therefore the regime has lost legitimacy, the regime is running on fumes, and just a puff of air, just a big, deep inhalation and an explosive exhalation will make Ayatollah Khamenei fall. Now, my friends from MI6 think this is fiction and this is delusion.
Of course.
They think this is illusion and delusion, and a lot of them believe that the Israelis have gone delusional. They are drinking their own Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Now, what is the British view? Not just the MI6 view, but the Foreign and Common Office view, the view from old friends from Oxford, and yes, the British sometimes can be exasperatingly supercilious, but at other times they have a pretty good understanding of the long durée of history, uh, as Peter will tell you. And the British view is quantity has its own quality. Iran is too big. Yes, the regime is corrupt. Yes, the regime is unpopular in urban areas and amongst the young, and especially women, but it retains enough support in rural and semi urban areas and the lower middle classes and the religious. So the, the regime still has the loyalty of those who have guns. And the Iranian Revolution in 1979 only succeeded because some of the people who owned guns switched sides. So, unless some of the people holding guns are convinced by the women marching on streets, you're not going to see them toppled. And the British estimation is we are not quite at toppling time. And in fact, just as the Pakistani military is now extraordinarily popular, despite locking up Imran Khan, because it was seen to stand up to the big bully India.
Right.
So it might well be the case that this conflict strengthens the regime instead of weakens it. So,
Young people, they might be irreligious or lukewarm Muslims, but they're not Jews or evangelical Christians.
correct,
They a
Yeah.
violent intervention from outside the state, especially from such an infamous actor as Israel, is more likely to galvanize them behind the regime than anything else.
correct. And some of the dissidents say that no, no, the regime has lost faith. It hasn't delivered for the people, which is true. It hasn't. But at the same time, they look at a power that is imposing starvation in Gaza. That's what they see on their screens. So they're not going to trust Israel to bring rivers of milk and honey to Iran. So it may be they trust their own bastard instead of another bastard. So
And we come back to the sanctions question because that
we
is a
will.
major
We will.
factor. Yeah.
But having said that, the Israeli point of view, which has its own logic to it, and time will tell out which perspective prevails and which set of assumptions holds true. They say that, look, the regime is not collapsing tomorrow. That's not a short term goal, it's a mid-term goal. And this is where we come to Peter's sanctions point. We turn the screws on Iran, we keep increasing economic pain, there is unemployment, people are eventually going to blame the regime. The regime is corrupt, the regime is unable to deliver. Increasingly, it is run by old men who are completely out of touch. And eventually, it'll fall under the weight of its own contradictions. And the dream scenario for the Israelis would be if the Azerbaijanis, their friends, take the Azeri bit, which they could. Should Iran weaken, the Azerbaijanis could have a little more territory. It'll be jolly good for them. The Kurds, if they could link up with the Iraqi Kurds and have some kind of de facto, if not de jure state, that would be lovely. And of course, the Kurds in Israel would be natural allies. And if the Balochis went their own way and they carved out their own territory from both Iran and Pakistan, that would be lovely. And that would weaken a Muslim nuclear armed state and a wannabe Muslim nuclear armed state. So, in the dream scenario for Israel, a weak, an Iran which is dismembered into various Syria like cantons, and an Iran which becomes more secular because the women overthrow the regime and the young people overthrow the regime, and they decide that, look, we are going to bring oil back onto the international market. We are going to have commerce, not chaos. in the words of Donald Trump. That is the dream scenario.
Yeah, it's like Riviera in Gaza. It's a dream scenario.
No, I think Iran has very clever people. Iranians are extraordinary merchants, and I think there is an element of possibility there. Should Iran turn away from a crazy Islamic regime, Iran could grow and would grow economically, and employment would improve dramatically in Iran. The problem for Iran has been that for the last few decades, it was ruled by a series of spectacularly incompetent governments. The Shah was basically weak, narcissistic, decadent. He blew
And
hundreds of
put in
millions.
place by the great Satan, of course.
Yes, installed, but he was there before that too. So the Shah's regime was at the same time autocratic and repressive and corrupt and didn't deliver at all, especially for the masses. They didn't even deliver literacy. And then they were followed by an ideological regime because people turned to religion. And you can blame the US for 1953. And my very dear friends
And the British, and the British.
who've
They,
retired from the CIA. Let me finish, Peter. I'll bring in the element of the British. My very dear friends who've retired from the CIA say that we went wrong and we were lackeys to the British in 1953 and we were manipulated by the British and we conducted a coup not really for American oil interests, but for British oil interests, for Anglo American Oil Company, which is now BP. And actually, really, that coup was because the British were not willing to give a 50-50 deal to Iran. They only wanted to give 16 or 17 cents to a dollar. And on top of that, they were doing creative accounting, and they weren't even paying that. And when Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a socialist but no communist, who was
yeah.
the first democratically elected leader of Iran, when he said that we need our fair share, basically the British convinced America, which was going through its own frenzy of the Cold War. These were the McCarthy years, after all. Peter can explain to you all about that. And because of that crazy paranoia in America, they kicked out Mossadegh. They conducted a coup. They feared that should Iran become communist, the rest of the Middle East will turn communist. There was the dominoes theory. And that was, as many have said, original sin in the Middle East. And that is what enabled 1979, because the Shah locked up all the secular opposition. Mossadegh himself died under house arrest. And that left the only organized body able to fill the vacuum as the Shia clergy. And indeed, it was the Shia clergy, Ayatollah Khamenei, who mobilized, who was living in Paris, actually, Peter. So the French have a lot to answer for.
Notre le Chateau.
Exactly. Who flew back in and took charge. So that is it in a nutshell, the origins. But at the moment, having said that, the British believe they've learned from their mistakes, hopefully, touch wood, fingers crossed, and they think that, look, Iran is too big. This won't happen. The Israelis think, no, eventually economic pain will lead to political revolution. Revolutions depend on the price of bread, as I say, and we'll just make the price of bread expensive for Iran. And eventually the young will overthrow the old and we'll have a different regime. So those are the various motivations, assumptions, strategies of the different players. Anyway, any further questions?
Well, sure. One more. Uh, I see what all sides are hoping for, uh, but assume that the best laid plans of mice and men go astray.
True.
Uh, Israel batters Iran and it wobbles, but it does topple.
Yeah.
And then we're all left staring at each other, alive and embarrassed.
Yeah.
What happens then? There has to be some kind of settlement.
Yeah, and so there are many scenarios here. Okay, and one is that after a few weeks, sense dawns and the Iranian regime says, we want to have our fortunes and we want to retain our palaces. And we will do a deal with the great Satan, with the US. Okay. And Israel says, yeah, we've achieved our ends. We've hit the nuclear strikes. We've killed the top military leadership. So we'll take time out. Maybe we'll kill them after a few months or a year, but we are done for now. That's one scenario, the benign scenario. Another scenario is that Iran hits, as it's threatening, Iran hits targets, UK, US, French, and the West, especially the US, is drawn into the war. And then, the US will strike with bunker busting bombs in Yadia, and then the Iranian regime will really suffer, and the Iranian people will suffer, and Tehran will look like Grozny in Chechnya or Baghdad.
Will Trump go along with that as a person, as a personality?
We don't know. So let me draw out the scenarios. Okay, so that is another one, and the war spirals out of control. There are some who even say, "Oh, Russia and China will jump in for Iran, and then we'll have the continental powers fighting the,
They are BRICS.
exactly, fighting the maritime powers, and we'll have World War III." Well, far fetched, but the conflict could broaden. Israel could strike facilities in the Gulf countries, although at the moment they have a peace brokered by China with the Gulf. So they'd be breaking that peace, and Iran could strike Gulf, oil facilities in the Gulf, and that would be breaking the peace Iran and Saudi Arabia have brokered by China, or rather by Oman, and then of course then everyone piles in. It becomes an Arab and Persian war. As of now, Iran has sympathy of the Muslim world. For instance, I'll give you an example. A politician from India called me yesterday, a Muslim politician, and kept talking about how the Gulf countries had sold out to the US and the Jews. Jewish bankers had bought the loyalty of Arab leaders who had their fortunes in France, the chateau that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has in France, close to where Peter used to live. We've seen it en route.
My next door neighbor.
Paris. And their money is in the city of London. It's in New York. It's elsewhere. And so, really, the only true Muslim power today that stands up for Islam is Iran. And this is a Sunni, not a Shia, saying this. A Sunni who claiming to be a direct descendant of the Prophet, a Sayyid. So Iran certainly has sympathy of the Muslim world. The question is, are they willing to let go of it? Because if they do strike the Gulf oil assets, now we are going to a Persian versus Arab, Sunni versus Shia, and the sympathy of this Sunni gentleman in India will disappear overnight. He will then side with his Sunni brethren. In any case, he says Allah Hafiz now. He doesn't say Khuda Hafiz. So the Arabization of the subcontinent has happened in the last 2 decades that I've been out of the country. No one said Allah Hafiz. Khuda Hafiz is the Persian term. Persian was the official language of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh till 1158. That is what everyone said. The last 20 years, the Arabs have managed to push Khuda Hafiz out and bring in Allah Hafiz. Well done, Saudis. Well done, maybe the Emiratis, but really the Saudis. So good. That would come in question. So it has risks. But if the extreme elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps take over, if they say, look, we have no option. Jordan is helping Israel shoot down our missiles and drones. We have to act. If that happens, then we don't know. Iran could also activate, and probably would activate, its Iraqi assets. Hezbollah is weakened, but hey ho, the Iraqi assets are still there, so they could make a move. Iran could obviously ask the Houthis, who are not entirely as obedient as Hezbollah, but yeah, they could cause problems on the Red Sea, even though there is supposedly a deal. But then the Houthis would be taking a risk of breaking a deal. So Iran could act in extreme ways. I'm hearing of scenarios that include hitting Jewish targets in Latin America. This is what my British friends are telling me, that there are risks for Jewish communities around the world, because if they can't hit Israel, then Iran may use Hezbollah and always have plausible deniability. The same thing that Pakistan does, use terror as an instrument of state policy and say, okay, now we go for Jewish targets. So a lot could happen in the extreme scenario. In the extreme scenario, this sort of conflict could drag on for months and intensify. So in the less extreme scenario, yeah, strikes continue for a while. Then everyone realizes this is too expensive. Israel cannot afford this war for too long. They're under acute economic strain as well. Also in Israel, the civil tensions, the social tensions are sharpening, because some people are doing their seventh tour of duty, some reservists. And the Haredis, the ultra Orthodox, are just praying and not serving and preaching. They clearly don't listen to Madonna. Papa don't preach. So you have extraordinary tension within Israel. And the war, whilst it is unifying in the short run, may become divisive in the long run. So lots of risks for everybody. So maybe everyone, after a while, says, we've all fought honorably, and each side proclaims victory or resistance or something, has some face saving story to tell their people, and pulls back from all out confrontation. That's also a possibility.
I know I'm backtracking a bit, but twice in this conversation, Atul mentioned conversations with MAGA folks and their opinions about the Middle East. Do you think, and I know this is very hypothetical, the American perspective on the current situation in the Middle East between Israel and Iran would be any different if Kamala Harris was in office? Thank you.
If Kamala Harris was in office, there'd be more pressure for her to restrain Israel and bring some sort of peace and stick to status quo. Now there'll be less pressure. And the reason there'd be more pressure is because the young and Arab voters and Muslim voters tend to go for the Democratic Party, and they have certainly great sympathies for Palestine. And there has been a shift away from Israeli sympathy in these sections. And they certainly would not want an all-out confrontation with Iran, so there'd be more pressure, but substantially not really, because all American politicians have, for now, have to be seen to be supporting Israel, come hell or high water. And Israel is the democratic state in an autocratic neighborhood. Israel is the ally in a troubled region. Israel, as some people joke, is the unsinkable American aircraft carrier in the Middle East. And for all of those reasons, the any administration would have to support Israel. And remember, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, if I remember correctly, that's the full form, said that Iran was in breach of the agreements they had made in the past and were trying to go nuclear. So if you are an Islamist regime run by mullahs and you're trying to acquire a nuclear bomb, any US administration will be nervous. And you've declared the US to be a great Satan. I mean, if you were president of the US, you would be trying very hard to stop Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. Just as it is in the mullah's
But
interest to get a bomb, it's in American interest to stop the mullahs from getting a bomb. And so, if if Israel strikes Iran's nuclear facilities, you may not entirely approve or even like it, but you have to go along with it.
But Israel is, of course, not in breach, even though they possess nuclear weapons. Simply, they're not in breach because they've never signed
Yeah,
any agreement.
they've never signed any agreement, and Israel.
But is it, okay? Let me ask this question: does anyone in the U.S. consider that to be
No,
hypocritical?
some people do. Maybe the young do. The young, of course, have misgivings about Israel and increasing misgivings about Israel. But I don't think most politicians do. First of all, no one thinks that much about the Middle East. Um, America is notoriously insular. If you heard the conversation on NPR, National Public Radio, it was all national. It was all about, or CNN or anywhere, it was all about the parade. No kings, no monarchs, whatever. There are protests all around the country to oppose the parade. So the focus has been on the budget. The focus has been on the parade. We have many Americans here. We have Caitlin Diana, who can tell us what's the news in Georgia. There's no focus at all, or I shouldn't use that. Not much focus on what's happening in Israel and Iran. It is the goodies beating the baddies.
Thank you both.
Good. Kate?
So, on that note, perhaps we've reached the end of the questions.
Thank you.
And we can call this the end of the session. Thank you, Atul, for giving us such quantities of information. I'm sure that as we follow the events which are unfolding below our noses as we speak and as we continue our own activities, we're going to discover that some of the hypotheses you've mentioned may play out, and some others that may play out that surprise
Exactly.
us.
Life is not just stranger than fiction, it is stranger than our imagination.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you, everyone, for your presence and your participation. And we'll say this is the end of the session. Goodbye.
So long.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.